way. It's a moral issue. We want people in America to work. That's the work ethic. We tell everybody, go out and get a job. And if someone's not working, we kind of, sneer at them, oh boy, he's on the take, he's on welfare, or whatever it is, all these slams at people for being poor. And yet, how do we think it's conscionable that someone could actually show up and have a job and do the work well and, not even make $10 an hour? And, if you're going to say to people, you have to go out and get a job, then they should have a fair expectation that if they have a job and they're paid for the job is going to at least pay enough that they can survive on, or their family can survive on. So in terms of now I know there are going to be issues, but let's start out by saying the bottom line is, we have to have a minimum wage that people can live on, which means it has to be raised. Now, if you want to have a political debate, should it first be raised to $12 and ultimately to $15, or how many years do you want to take till you get there? That's a political discussion, and I'm willing to have that debate. But we should not in America have a debate when more and more there's this great gap between the few that have and the great masses that don't. And the great masses, by the way, are becoming larger and larger, not through any particular fault of their own, but times have changed. Technology has intervened. We aren't manufacturing things here in America anymore as we once used to. When jobs where you didn't need a lot of education for, when those jobs were in factories and producing things, those jobs, they had unions. And so a guy who was a factory worker, even if he didn't have a college education, you could make a good living because the unions were organized for those kind of jobs, for the factories, for automakers, et cetera, electrical workers, steel makers. But as those industries decline in America, because we moved into the era of technology, all of a sudden, there aren't enough jobs where people that don't have a lot of education can have. And so that's why they all wind up in these service industries, working at a McDonald's, working at a fast food place. That's what's happening. Now, that's not any of the people of lower income's fault. It's not even the fault of wealthy. It's nobody's fault. Society has moved on. But the people who are not that well educated, all of a sudden, there's no one pushing, because there are no unions for those people, there's no one pushing to see that they make a decent wage. So the argument has to be, we have to raise the minimum wage. And if there are demonstrations for it, and people have to stop complaining that the traffic is held up because people are marching for a $15 a wage. I mean, really, aren't we embarrassed to complain about that? You will find that the people that are opposed to raising the minimum wage very rarely are people that are living on the minimum wage themselves. Now, the arguments against the minimum wage, and what they will say is, if you raise the minimum wage, the employer says, particularly of a smaller business, I'm not going to be able to hire as many people because if I have to pay each worker more, there's going to be less money to go around, et cetera. There will be some that fall into that category, but don't kid yourself. It's exaggerated. And the reason is nobody is hiring more people than they need right now. Very few businesses are saying, we don't need more workers, but what the heck? Bad economic times. Anyone who wants a job, come on down and we'll figure something out for you to do. No. Every business is hiring exactly the number of people they need. So if you raise the minimum wage, it's not as if they suddenly need less people. They're still going to need them. In some cases, they'll have to raise the price of their goods. It's going to get passed on to the society as a whole. But if you raise the minimum wage, the first dollar anybody ever makes, he or she has to spend. It's not a luxury dollar, it's a survival dollar. So we're pouring more money into the economy, which raises the consumer level, and all of a sudden that helps. It will increase unemployment in certain areas. Then you know what? Then we'll have public works. That's right, we'll have public works. We don't care how someone has to make a living, whether it's the private dollar or the public dollar, preferably the private dollar. But if the private dollar doesn't employ enough people, then the public dollar has to. And what we're having is politicians that are trying to cut everything. On the one hand, they don't want to raise the minimum wage. And then you say, well, how about a public works program? Oh, we don't want people on the public till. No, we're not going to do that. Well, how about spending more money for education? How about raising our taxes for education so people can at least have the skills that they're going to need in the new job market? Oh, don't be talking about raising our taxes there. In other words, every policy we have seems to be to make it tougher and tougher for people at the bottom end of the economic scale to climb on. So the first thing, which shouldn't even be a debate, this is the United States of America. Of course we should have a higher minimum wage. You can't live on what the minimum wage is today. And then we're shocked that people go out to try to sell drugs, or they try and make money, in the black market, or doing whatever they're doing. If someone has to eat, they're going to find a way to eat. And we're not going to always like the way they do it. So it's a much better idea that let people make a living by the wage they get, and make the wage at least decent.